In the bitter winter of 1867, Helena Morrison clutched her infant daughter as she faced the brutal truth. She was completely alone in the Dakota Territory with nowhere to turn. When a mysterious newspaper editor offered her shelter and work, it seemed like salvation. But what will happen when a dangerous man from her past arrives demanding payment for debts that could destroy everything she's fought to rebuild? The baby's cry cut through the howling wind like a knife through silence. Helena Morrison pressed her daughter closer to her chest, feeling the tiny body shiver against the thin blanket that was all she had left to keep them warm. The snow fell so hard she could barely see 3 feet ahead, and her boots had holes that let the cold bite at her toes with every step. "Hush now, Lily," she whispered, though her own voice shook from more than just the February cold. "We'll find somewhere safe soon." But Helena knew those were the words of someone trying to fool herself. 3 days ago, she had buried her husband David in the frozen ground outside Denver. 2 days ago, she had spent their last coins on a wagon ride north to the Dakota Territory, chasing rumors of work in the mining towns. Yesterday, the wagon driver had left her at a crossroads with nothing but directions to walk 5 more miles to reach Deadwood. Now the sun was setting, painting the snow-covered prairie in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if Helena wasn't so scared. Her stomach felt hollow as a drum, and Lily hadn't stopped fussing since noon. The baby was hungry, and Helena had nothing left to give her. The first lights of Deadwood appeared like tiny stars in the distance. Helena quickened her pace, ignoring the sharp pain in her feet where the cold had made them numb. Music drifted on the wind, piano notes and laughter from the saloons that lined the main street. Somewhere in that town, there had to be someone who would help a woman with a baby. The main street stretched before her like a river of mud and horse tracks. Yellow light spilled from windows, and Helena could see people moving inside the warm buildings. Men in thick coats walked between the saloons and shops, their breath making clouds in the cold air. None of them looked at her as she stumbled down the wooden sidewalk. Helena stopped in front of the first building with a sign that said, "Meals and Beds." Her heart pounded as she pushed open the heavy wooden door. The inside was warm and bright, filled with the smell of beef stew and fresh bread that made her mouth water. A large woman with gray hair and flour on her apron looked up from wiping down a table. Her eyes moved from Helena's face to the bundle in her arms, and her expression changed from welcome to suspicion. "We're full up," the woman said before Helena could speak. "Please, ma'am, I can pay." Helena started to reach for the small purse hidden in her coat. "I said we're full." The woman's voice was hard as winter stone. "And we don't take in women with complications." Helena felt her cheeks burn with shame. She understood what the woman meant. A woman alone with a baby meant trouble. It meant questions people didn't want to ask and problems they didn't want to handle. Back on the street, the cold hit her like a slap. Lily's crying grew louder, and Helena bounced her gently while looking for another place to try. The general store was closed, its windows dark. The barber shop had a sign that said, "Men only." The dress shop looked empty except for fabric rolls and sewing supplies. At the saloon called the Lucky Strike, Helena hesitated. She had never been inside such a place, but the sound of voices and the promise of warmth drew her forward. She pushed through the swinging doors and stepped into a world of smoke and noise. The talking stopped like someone had blown out a candle. Every face in the room turned to stare at her. Men in dirty work clothes and fancy suits all looked at her with the same expression, surprise mixed with disapproval. A woman in a bright red dress with painted lips walked over, her shoes clicking on the wooden floor. "Honey, you're in the wrong place," the woman said, not unkindly. "This ain't somewhere for ladies with babies." "I just need a place to stay for the night," Helena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can work. I can clean or cook or—" "Not here, you can't." The woman glanced around the room at the watching men. "These boys don't want reminders of home when they're trying to forget their troubles. Take my advice and find somewhere else." Helena nodded and backed toward the door, feeling the weight of all those eyes on her. Outside, the wind had picked up, and snow was falling harder than before. She pulled her thin shawl tighter around Lily and started walking again. The next 3 buildings she tried gave her the same answer. No room. Not the right kind of place. Try somewhere else. Each rejection felt like a door slamming in her face, and with each one, Helena felt herself getting smaller and more desperate. By the time she reached the end of the main street, her legs were shaking from cold and exhaustion. Lily's crying had turned into weak whimpers that scared Helena more than the loud wails. The baby needed food and warmth, and Helena was failing to provide either. She found herself standing in front of a small building with a sign that read, Deadwood Tribune News and Printing. A thin line of light showed under the door, and Helena could hear the sound of someone moving around inside. This was her last chance before she would have to find somewhere to sleep in the cold. Helena raised her hand to knock, then stopped. What if this person turned her away too? What if there was nowhere in this entire town that would take in a woman with a baby? What would she do then? Lily made a soft sound, and Helena looked down at her daughter's face. The baby's lips were turning blue from the cold, and her tiny fingers felt like ice. Helena couldn't give up now. She had to keep trying, no matter how many doors closed in her face. She knocked on the door of the newspaper office, 3 firm raps that echoed in the quiet street. Inside, the sound stopped. Footsteps approached the door, and Helena held her breath, praying that this time would be different. We're closed for the night, came a gruff voice from behind the door. Helena's heart sank, but she didn't move away. Please, sir. I'm not looking to buy anything. I just need help. The voice on the other side grew quiet. Helena could imagine the person thinking, deciding whether to open the door or pretend he hadn't heard her. She pressed her face closer to the cold wood. I have a baby, she called out, desperation making her voice crack. She's so cold, and I don't have anywhere to go. The silence stretched so long that Helena thought the person had walked away. Then she heard the sound of a lock turning, and the door opened. A man stood in the doorway, his hair messy and ink stains on his white shirt. He wore spectacles that had slid down his nose, and his sleeves were rolled up to his elbows. Behind him, Helena could see a room filled with papers, printing equipment, and the blessed warmth of a wood-burning stove. Good heavens, the man said, taking in the sight of Helena covered in snow with the baby in her arms. You'll freeze to death out there. Come in quickly. Helena stepped into the warmth, and it felt like stepping into heaven. The heat from the stove wrapped around her like a blanket, and for the first time in hours, she could feel her fingers and toes again. Lily stopped whimpering and seemed to relax in her arms. Sit down before you fall down, the man said, pulling a chair closer to the stove. You look ready to collapse. Helena sank into the chair gratefully. The man disappeared into a back room and returned with a thick blanket, which he wrapped around her shoulders without asking permission. I'm Marcus Webb, he said, settling into another chair. I run this newspaper. And you are? Helena Morrison. She shifted Lily so the man could see her better. This is my daughter, Lily. Marcus studied them both with kind eyes that reminded Helena of her father. How long have you been walking in this weather? Since morning. I came from Denver, looking for work. Denver's a long way from here. Marcus got up and moved to a small table where a coffee pot sat warming on a metal plate. Are you running from something, Mrs. Morrison? The question was asked gently, but Helena felt her spine stiffen. My husband died 3 weeks ago. I heard there might be work up north. Marcus poured coffee into a tin cup and brought it to her. The liquid was hot and bitter, but it was the most wonderful thing Helena had tasted in days. The warmth spread through her chest and helped clear the fog from her tired mind. What kind of work are you looking for? Marcus asked, settling back into his chair. Anything honest. I can read and write better than most. My father was a teacher back in Ohio before we moved west. Marcus's eyebrows raised with interest. Can you set type? Handle correspondence. Helena's pulse quickened. I've never tried typesetting, but I learn quickly. I used to help my father with his lesson plans and school reports. Marcus looked around his cluttered office. I've been managing this place alone for 2 years. Could use someone to help with the writing and organizing. The pay isn't much, but there's a small room upstairs. Has its own stove and everything. Helena felt like someone had just offered her the moon and stars. Sir, I couldn't impose like that. You don't even know me. I know you're a mother trying to keep her child safe. I know you walked through a blizzard looking for honest work instead of begging for handouts. Marcus refilled his own coffee cup. And I know my newspaper has been a mess since my last helper ran off to try his luck in the gold fields. Lily made a soft cooing sound, and both adults looked down at her. The baby's color had returned to pink, and her eyes were open and alert for the first time since they'd arrived in town. She's beautiful, Marcus said softly. How old? 3 months. Helena's voice grew thick with emotion. She's all I have left. Marcus was quiet for a moment watching the baby. My wife and I wanted children, but it never happened for us. She died of the fever 5 years ago. He looked up at Helena. This place gets lonely with just one person rattling around in it. You're very kind, Mr. Webb, but I don't want you to feel sorry for us. This isn't about feeling sorry for anyone, Marcus said firmly. This is about practical business. I need help and you need work. Seems like we might be able to solve both problems. Helena looked around the office, taking in the stacks of papers, the printing press that dominated one corner, and the general chaos that spoke of a man trying to do too much by himself. It was exactly the kind of challenge she had always enjoyed, bringing order to confusion, finding the story hidden in the mess. What would you expect me to do? She asked. Help me get the weekly edition out on time, for starters. Handle the subscription list, maybe write some articles about what's happening around town. Nothing too complicated at first, but room to grow if you're interested. As Marcus talked, Helena found herself imagining what it would be like to have a real job again, to use her mind for something more than just surviving from one day to the next. She had always loved writing, had dreamed of being a real journalist someday. The room upstairs, she said carefully. Would it be suitable for a baby? It's got good light and stays warm. Previous occupant left behind a rocking chair that might come in handy. Marcus smiled. And I'm a light sleeper, so if you needed help in the middle of the night. Helena felt tears prick at her eyes. After days of rejection and closed doors, this stranger was offering her more kindness than she had dared to hope for. I accept, she said quickly, before she could change her mind or he could reconsider. When would you like me to start? How about tomorrow morning? That'll give you tonight to settle in and rest up. Marcus stood and moved toward a door at the back of the office. Let me show you upstairs. The room above the newspaper office was small but clean, with a bed, a table, and the promised rocking chair by the window. A pot-bellied stove sat in one corner, already loaded with wood and ready to light. After the cold street and the uncertain night that had stretched ahead of them, it looked like a palace to Helena. Mr. Webb, she said as he prepared to leave her alone. Why are you helping us? Marcus paused in the doorway, considering his answer. Maybe because everyone deserves a second chance. Maybe because this town could use more decent people. Or maybe just because it's the right thing to do. After he left, Helena sat in the rocking chair with Lily in her arms, looking out at the snow-covered street below. For the first time since David's death, she felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. But even as she rocked her daughter to sleep, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered warnings. Good things didn't usually last for people like her. Sooner or later, something would go wrong, and she would find herself back out in the cold. For tonight, though, she was warm and safe, and that was enough. The crash of falling metal jolted Helena awake before dawn. She sat up in bed, heart racing, as Lily began to cry from the sudden noise below. Heavy footsteps stomped across the newspaper office floor, followed by a string of words that would make a preacher blush. Sorry, Marcus called up the stairs. Just knocked over the typecase. Go back to sleep. But Helena was already wrapping her shawl around her shoulders and lifting Lily from the makeshift cradle Marcus had fashioned from a wooden crate. Sleep had been hard to come by anyway, her mind spinning with questions about what this new life might hold. Downstairs, Marcus stood surrounded by tiny metal letters scattered across the floor like fallen stars. His hair stuck up at odd angles, and he looked like he hadn't slept either. "Let me help," Helena said, bouncing Lily gently to quiet her fussing. "You don't start work until after breakfast?" Marcus protested. But he looked grateful as Helena began gathering the scattered type with her free hand. "What were you trying to do at this hour?" Marcus rubbed his tired eyes. "Getting the weekly edition ready. We go to print today, and I'm behind schedule. The territorial governor is coming through town next week, and I need to have the story ready." Helena examined one of the metal letters, fascinated by how the printing process worked. "How long does it usually take you?" "Too long when I'm doing it alone." Marcus began sorting the letters back into their proper compartments. "Used to have help, but Jake decided gold mining looked easier than newspaper work. Show me how it's done." Marcus looked up, surprised. "You sure? It's tedious work, and your hands will be black with ink by the end." Helena thought of all the tedious work she had done in her life, washing clothes by hand, mending torn fabric, copying her father's lesson plans in careful script. "I'm not afraid of getting my hands dirty." The next hour passed quickly as Marcus taught Helena the basics of typesetting. Each letter had to be placed backwards in the form, building words and sentences that would print correctly when pressed onto paper. It was like solving a puzzle, and Helena found herself enjoying the careful precision it required. "You're a natural at this," Marcus said, watching her work. "Most people can't get the hang of reading backwards so quickly." Lily had fallen asleep in her crate nearby, lulled by the rhythmic sounds of their work. The morning sun streamed through the office windows, turning the floating dust particles into tiny dancers in the golden light. "Tell me about this governor's visit," Helena said as she placed another line of type. Marcus's expression grew serious. "Governor Crawford is making rounds to all the mining towns, supposedly to check on territorial business. But word is he's really here to see which communities are worth keeping and which ones might get left behind when statehood comes." What does that mean for Deadwood? Could mean everything or nothing. Towns that impress him might get better roads, telegraph lines, maybe even a railroad connection someday. Towns that don't. Marcus shrugged. "Well, there are plenty of ghost towns in these hills already." Helena absorbed this information while continuing her work. She was beginning to understand that life in the frontier wasn't just about surviving the weather and finding food. Politics and progress could change everything overnight. "What kind of story are you planning to write?" she asked. "That's the problem. I've been trying to figure out what angle to take. Do I write about our mining production? Our growing population? The new businesses opening up?" Marcus ran his ink-stained fingers through his hair. "Nothing feels quite right." Helena paused in her work, thinking, "What makes Deadwood different from other mining towns?" "Different how?" "You said the governor is visiting lots of places. What would make him remember this one?" Marcus considered the question. "Well, we've got more families moving in than most mining camps. Usually these places are just men looking to get rich quick and move on. But Deadwood is starting to feel more permanent." "Like me and Lily?" "Exactly. Real families building real lives. Children being born, schools being planned, women starting businesses." Marcus's eyes lit up with sudden inspiration. "That's it. That's the story." Helena felt a flutter of excitement as she watched Marcus's face change. "What story?" "The story of how Deadwood isn't just another mining camp. It's becoming a real community. A place where people like you can start over and build something lasting." Marcus grabbed a pencil and began scribbling notes. "I could interview some of the other families, talk about the plans for a proper school, maybe even mention the church group that's been meeting in the back room of Sullivan's store." As Marcus talked, Helena found herself caught up in his enthusiasm. This was more than just a newspaper story, it was a vision of what Deadwood could become. "Would you help me with the interviews?" Marcus asked suddenly. Some of the women might be more comfortable talking to another woman. Helena's heart skipped. "You want me to help write the story?" "Why not? You understand what it's like to come here looking for a fresh start. That perspective could make all the difference." The idea both thrilled and terrified Helena. She had always loved writing, but this would be different from the letters and journals she had kept before. This would be something that mattered, something that could help shape the future of their town. "I'd like that very much," she said. They spent the rest of the morning planning their approach. Marcus would handle the business owners and town officials, while Helena would talk to the families and women who were building homes and lives in Deadwood. Their first stop was the boarding house where Helena had been turned away the night before. In the daylight, with Marcus beside her and a clear purpose in mind, the place looked less forbidding. Mrs. Patterson, the gray-haired woman who had refused Helena shelter, looked surprised to see her returning with the newspaper editor. "We're working on a story about families in Deadwood," Marcus explained. "Mrs. Morrison here is helping me with the interviews." Helena felt Mrs. Patterson's eyes studying her, taking in her clean clothes and the way she carried herself differently than she had the night before. There was a power in having a job and a purpose that changed how people saw you. "I suppose I could spare a few minutes," Mrs. Patterson said grudgingly. The interview revealed that Mrs. Patterson had been running the boarding house for 3 years, slowly building a reputation for cleanliness and good food. She had turned away Helena not out of cruelty, but out of fear that her establishment would be seen as the kind of place that took in desperate women. "Nothing personal, you understand," Mrs. Patterson said, not quite meeting Helena's eyes. "But a boarding house has to maintain certain standards." Helena nodded, understanding better now how fear could make people act in ways that seemed heartless. Mrs. Patterson was protecting something she had worked hard to build, just as Helena was trying to build something new for herself and Lily. Their next stop was the general store, where they met Emma Chen, a Chinese woman who had started a small restaurant in the back room. Emma's story was different. She had come to Deadwood with her husband to escape prejudice in California, only to find similar challenges here. "Some people, they don't want to eat food made by Chinese hands," Emma said matter-of-factly. "But others, they taste my dumplings and come back every day." Helena found herself admiring Emma's quiet determination. Like Helena, she was building something new from nothing, facing down suspicion with hard work and skill. As they walked between interviews, Helena noticed how Marcus greeted people on the street. He knew everyone's name, asked about their families, remembered details from previous conversations. He wasn't just the town's newspaper editor. He was its memory and its voice. "You care about these people," Helena observed. "They're my neighbors. Their stories matter." Marcus stopped to help an elderly man load supplies into his wagon. A town is only as strong as the people who believe in it. By evening, they had collected a dozen stories. Families who had traveled hundreds of miles to start over, women who had started businesses with nothing but determination, children who were the first in their families born in the Dakota Territory. Back at the office, Helena fed Lily while Marcus organized their notes. The baby was growing stronger every day, her eyes brighter and more alert. She seemed to enjoy the bustle of the newspaper office, gurgling happily at the sounds of the printing press and the scratch of pencils on paper. "So how do we tell all these stories in one article?" Helena asked. Marcus spread their notes across his desk. "We find the common thread. What connects Mrs. Patterson and Emma Chen and all the others?" Helena studied the papers, thinking about the conversations they had shared throughout the day. "Hope," she said finally. "They all came here hoping for something better, and they're all building it, piece by piece." Marcus began drafting the opening paragraph. "That's what makes Deadwood different. It's not just a place where people come to get rich quick. It's a place where they come to build futures." As Helena watched Marcus write, she felt something stirring inside her. A sense of belonging she hadn't experienced since her father's death years before. She was part of something important now, something that mattered beyond just her own survival. But even as she felt this new hope taking root, a small worry nagged at the back of her mind. Good things had a way of disappearing just when she needed them most. How long would it be before something went wrong? "Mama, the funny man is here again," called out 6-year-old Tommy Sullivan as he burst through the door of his family's store. Helena looked up from the inventory list she was checking for Mrs. Sullivan. 3 weeks had passed since she started working for Marcus, and she had fallen into a comfortable routine of splitting her time between the newspaper and helping other businesses around town. "What funny man?" Mrs. Sullivan asked, wiping flour from her hands. The one with the fancy clothes who asks too many questions, Tommy said, peering out the window. He's talking to Mr. Henderson at the bank. Helena felt a chill run down her spine. She moved to the window and looked out to see a well-dressed stranger in conversation with the bank manager. The man's clothes were too fine for Deadwood, his horse too sleek, his manner too smooth. Probably just another investor looking to buy mining claims, Mrs. Sullivan said. But Helena noticed the woman's voice carried a note of uncertainty. Helena finished the inventory quickly and hurried back to the newspaper office, Lily strapped to her chest in the carrier Marcus had made from old canvas. She found him hunched over his desk, writing furiously. "Marcus, there's a stranger in town asking questions at the bank," she said without preamble. Marcus looked up, his expression troubled. "About what kind of questions?" "I don't know, but Mrs. Sullivan's boy said he's been around for a few days." "Have you seen him?" "No, but—" Marcus set down his pen. "I've been hearing whispers. Some of the miners are talking about men coming around, asking about property values and who owns what." Helena felt her stomach tighten. In her experience, when strangers started asking questions about property and ownership, it usually meant trouble for people like her, people who had very little and couldn't afford to lose it. What kind of men? Land speculators, maybe, or railroad scouts. Marcus stood and moved to the window. With all the talk about statehood, there's money to be made in buying up property cheap and selling it dear once development comes. Helena joined him at the window, shifting Lily to her hip. The stranger was still talking to the bank manager, but now she could see him more clearly. He was a handsome man in his 30s, with dark hair and confident posture that spoke of money and education. "He doesn't look like the rough types who usually come through here," she observed. "No, he doesn't." Marcus grabbed his hat from a peg by the door. "I think it's time I introduced myself. Stay here with Lily." Helena watched through the window as Marcus approached the stranger and the bank manager. She couldn't hear their conversation, but she could see the stranger's face change when Marcus introduced himself as the newspaper editor. The man's smile became more guarded, his manner more careful. After a few minutes, Marcus returned to the office, his expression grim. "His name is Robert Caldwell," Marcus said, removing his hat. "Says he's a businessman from Denver, looking into investment opportunities." Helena's blood turned to ice. The room seemed to spin around her, and she had to grab the edge of Marcus's desk to steady herself. "Helena? What's wrong?" Marcus was at her side immediately, his hand on her arm. I know that name." Helena's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Robert Caldwell was my husband's business partner." Marcus's eyes widened. "Are you certain?" Helena nodded, her mind racing. "He tried to claim David owed him money after the funeral. I thought I left all that behind in Denver." "What kind of money?" "He said David had borrowed from him to buy mining equipment. But David never mentioned any debt, and the papers Caldwell showed me." Helena trailed off, remembering how sick David had been near the end, how confused and desperate he had become. Marcus guided her to a chair. "Tell me exactly what happened." Helena took a shaky breath and told Marcus about Caldwell's visit after David's funeral, how he had produced documents claiming David owed him $500, how he had suggested there might be other ways for Helena to pay the debt if she couldn't come up with the money. "I used the last of our savings to get away from him," Helena finished. "I thought if I came far enough north, he'd never find me." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing what she had told him. "Helena, did you ever see these papers he claimed your husband signed?" "He showed them to me, but I was so upset I couldn't think clearly. David's signature was on them, but—" Helena paused, remembering. But something felt wrong about it. The writing looked shaky, not like David's usual hand. "Your husband was very ill before he died? The lung fever had him so weak he could barely hold a pen. Towards the end, he was signing papers without really understanding what they were." Helena felt tears threatening. "I should have paid more attention, should have protected him better." "This isn't your fault," Marcus said firmly. "But we need to figure out what Caldwell really wants and why he's here now." As if summoned by their conversation, the office door opened and Robert Caldwell stepped inside. He was even more imposing up close, tall and broad-shouldered, with piercing blue eyes and a smile that didn't reach them. "Mrs. Morrison," he said smoothly, "what a pleasant surprise to find you here." Helena instinctively pulled Lily closer to her chest. "Mr. Caldwell. And you must be Mr. Webb," Caldwell continued, extending his hand to Marcus. "I understand you've been kind enough to give Mrs. Morrison employment." Marcus shook the offered hand but kept his expression neutral. "Mrs. Morrison is an excellent worker. We're fortunate to have her." "I'm sure you are." Caldwell's gaze moved around the office, taking in the printing press, the stacks of papers, the evidence of a thriving business. Deadwood seems to be a prosperous little town. "I can see why Mrs. Morrison chose to settle here." "What brings you to our territory, Mr. Caldwell?" Marcus asked. "Business opportunities, mainly. I'm always interested in communities with growth potential." Caldwell's smile widened. "Of course. I also had some unfinished business with Mrs. Morrison that needs to be resolved." Helena found her voice. "I told you in Denver that David didn't owe you any money." "Ah, but I'm afraid you were mistaken about that." Caldwell reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded paper. "I have all the documentation right here. Your late husband borrowed $500 from me just 2 weeks before his death. With interest, the debt now stands at $600. Marcus stepped forward. "May I see those documents?" Caldwell hesitated for just a moment before handing over the papers. Marcus examined them carefully, his trained eye taking in every detail. "This promissory note is dated February 10th, Marcus said slowly. "But Mrs. Morrison told me her husband died on February 8th. Helena's heart stopped. She looked at the date Marcus was pointing to, then at Caldwell's face. The man's smooth confidence faltered for just a second before returning. "A simple error in dating," Caldwell said quickly. "Your husband was very ill, Mrs. Morrison. These things happen when a man is not in his right mind. Or when someone forges documents after the fact," Marcus said quietly. The tension in the room became thick as winter air. Caldwell's friendly mask slipped completely, revealing something cold and dangerous underneath. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Webb. I hope you can prove it." "I hope I don't have to." Marcus handed the papers back to Caldwell. "But I think you should know that Mrs. Morrison has friends in this town now. People who care about what happens to her." Caldwell looked between Marcus and Helena, calculating something behind his eyes. Finally, he folded the papers and put them back in his jacket. "I'm a reasonable man, Mrs. Morrison. I understand you may need time to raise the money. Shall we say 1 week? That should give you time to liquidate your assets." The threat was clear. Helena had 1 week to find $600 or face the consequences. After Caldwell left, Helena sank into her chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what faced her. $600 might as well have been 6,000. She had managed to save a little from her work with Marcus, but nowhere near enough to satisfy Caldwell's demands. "We'll figure this out," Marcus said, but Helena could hear the worry in his voice. "How? Even if we could prove those documents are fake, who would believe us over him? He has money and education and respectability." Marcus was quiet for a moment, thinking, maybe we don't need to prove the documents are fake. Maybe we just need to prove that Caldwell isn't the respectable businessman he pretends to be. Helena looked up at him, hope flickering in her chest. "What do you mean?" "I mean it's time to do what newspaper editors do best," Marcus said, reaching for his pen. "Investigate." As Helena watched Marcus begin to plan their strategy, she felt a strange mixture of fear and determination. Caldwell had found her. Yes, but this time she wasn't facing him alone. This time she had allies and a purpose beyond just survival. But even as she tried to feel hopeful, Helena couldn't shake the feeling that the fight ahead would test everything she had built in Deadwood. Would her new life be strong enough to survive the storm that was coming? The telegram crackled in Marcus's hands like fire as he read the words that could destroy everything. Helena watched his face change from hope to confusion to something that looked like fear. "What does it say?" Helena asked, bouncing Lily nervously as they stood in the telegraph office. Marcus folded the paper quickly, but not before Helena caught a glimpse of the sender's name. Denver City Marshal. "We need to get back to the office. Now." The walk back felt endless. Every person they passed on the street seemed to be watching them, and Helena couldn't shake the feeling that word was already spreading about whatever news that telegram contained. Deadwood was a small town where secrets didn't stay hidden for long. Back at the newspaper office, Marcus finally showed her the telegram. Helena's hands shook as she read the devastating message. Robert Caldwell wanted for fraud in Denver. Warrant issued. Exercise extreme caution. Marshal arriving Tuesday. "Tuesday is tomorrow," Helena whispered. "I know." Marcus began pacing the small office. "This should be good news, Helena. If Caldwell is wanted for fraud, then his documents are probably fake, just like we suspected." "Then why do you look so worried?" Marcus stopped pacing and faced her. "Because a cornered animal is the most dangerous kind. If Caldwell knows the law is closing in, he might do something desperate." As if summoned by their fears, the office door burst open. Caldwell stood in the doorway, but he looked nothing like the smooth businessman from the day before. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair uncombed, and his eyes held a wild gleam that made Helena step back instinctively. "You sent that telegram," Caldwell said, pointing an accusing finger at Marcus. "You've been digging into my business." "Just doing my job as a journalist," Marcus replied calmly, though Helena noticed his hand moving slowly toward the desk drawer where he kept his pistol. "Your job?" Caldwell laughed, but the sound held no humor. "Your job is to mind your own business and let me collect what's owed to me." "Nothing is owed to you," Helena said, finding her courage. "Those papers are fake, and we both know it." Caldwell's attention snapped to her. "Careful, Mrs. Morrison. You're in no position to make accusations." "Actually, she is." Marcus had managed to get his hand on the pistol and was now holding it steady, pointed at Caldwell. "The Denver Marshal is arriving tomorrow. I think you should be gone before then." Helena expected Caldwell to back down, but instead he smiled. A cold, calculating expression that chilled her blood. "You think a telegram scares me? You think some small-town marshal can touch me?" Caldwell reached into his coat, and Helena's heart stopped until she realized he was pulling out papers, not a weapon. "I have friends in high places, Mr. Webb. Friends who don't appreciate interference in their business arrangements." "What kind of friends?" Marcus asked, but Helena could hear uncertainty creeping into his voice. "The kind who own judges and mayors and territorial officials." Caldwell spread the papers on Marcus's desk. "The kind who can make sure this little newspaper of yours loses its license to operate. The kind who can have Mrs. Morrison arrested for theft of services if she doesn't pay her legitimate debts." Helena looked at the papers and felt her world crumbling. These weren't the crude forgeries she had expected, but official-looking documents bearing impressive seals and signatures. Even if they were fake, they looked real enough to fool a judge who wasn't looking too closely. "These are forgeries," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Prove it." Caldwell gathered up the papers. "In the meantime, I'll be talking to the territorial judge who's arriving with the governor next week. I'm sure he'll be very interested in Mrs. Morrison's case." After Caldwell left, Helena sank into her chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they faced. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about her freedom, her ability to stay with Lily, everything she had built in Deadwood. "He's bluffing," Marcus said, but he didn't sound convinced. "What if he's not? What if he really does have those kinds of connections?" Helena looked down at Lily, who was sleeping peacefully in her arms, unaware of the danger surrounding them. "I can't go to jail, Marcus. What would happen to Lily?" Marcus holstered his pistol and began pacing again. "We need help. Real help. From someone who understands the legal system better than we do." "Who?" "The closest real lawyer is probably in Cheyenne, and we don't have time to get there and back." "Maybe we don't need a lawyer. Maybe we need something else." Marcus stopped pacing and looked at Helena with sudden intensity. What if we could prove Caldwell has done this before? What if we could show a pattern of fraud that even his high-placed friends couldn't ignore? How would we do that? By finding his other victims. By showing that you're not the only widow he's tried to cheat. Helena felt a spark of hope. You think there are others? Men like Caldwell don't just wake up one day and decide to forge documents. They perfect their methods over time, probably starting small and getting bolder. Marcus was already reaching for his coat. I'm going to send some telegrams to other towns, other newspapers. If Caldwell has been running this scheme for a while, someone will have heard of him. What should I do? Stay here. Keep Lily safe. And if Caldwell comes back, Marcus handed her the pistol. Don't hesitate to use this. Helena stared at the weapon in her hands. She had never fired a gun in her life, but the weight of it felt reassuring somehow. She was no longer the helpless woman who had stumbled into Deadwood 3 weeks ago. Alone in the office with Lily, Helena tried to stay busy organizing papers and setting type for the next edition. But her mind kept returning to Caldwell's threats and the implications of what he had said about having powerful friends. Around noon, Mrs. Sullivan appeared at the office door carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "Brought you some lunch?" the older woman said, but Helena could see worry in her eyes. "Heard there was some kind of trouble brewing." "News travels fast in a small town," Helena said, accepting the basket gratefully. "Faster when it involves someone folks have come to care about." Mrs. Sullivan settled into a chair, making it clear she intended to stay for a while. "Tell me what's really going on, dear." Helena found herself pouring out the whole story. David's death, Caldwell's first approach in Denver, her flight to Deadwood, and now the return of her tormentor with even more dangerous threats. Mrs. Sullivan listened without interruption, her expression growing more serious with each detail. When Helena finished, the older woman was quiet for a long moment. "You know," Mrs. Sullivan said finally, "my late husband used to say that bullies rely on their victims being too scared or too isolated to fight back. But Caldwell has money and connections and you have something he doesn't expect," Mrs. Sullivan interrupted. "You have friends now. People who care what happens to you. What can friends do against someone like him?" Mrs. Sullivan smiled. "More than you might think. Let me tell you about what happened to the last man who tried to cheat folks in this town." The story Mrs. Sullivan told was about a traveling salesman who had sold worthless mining equipment to several families, taking their money and disappearing before they realized they'd been cheated. When the victims had banded together and tracked him down, they hadn't needed lawyers or lawmen to get justice. "Sometimes," Mrs. Sullivan said, "the court of public opinion is more powerful than any judge." Helena was beginning to understand what the older woman was suggesting. "You think we should expose Caldwell publicly?" "I think we should make sure everyone in town knows exactly what kind of man he is before he has a chance to present his side to the territorial judge." The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. Helena had never been the kind of person to seek attention or make waves. But then again, she had never been the kind of person to set type for a newspaper or carry a loaded pistol either. When Marcus returned that evening, he was carrying a handful of telegram responses and wearing an expression of grim satisfaction. 3 other towns, he announced without preamble. 3 other towns where widows have reported being approached by a man matching Caldwell's description, making similar claims about debts owed by their dead husbands. Helena felt her heart racing. What happened to those women? 2 of them paid him money they couldn't afford to lose. The 3rd disappeared completely. No one knows if she fled or... Marcus didn't finish the sentence. Or what? Or if something worse happened to her. Helena felt cold fingers of fear crawling up her spine. She had been thinking of Caldwell as a greedy opportunist, but what if he was something much more dangerous? "There's more," Marcus continued. "One of the newspapers sent me copies of some questionable documents they found in their files. Legal papers that were supposedly filed in their county courthouse, but that the courthouse has no record of. Forgeries. Sophisticated ones. The kind that would fool most people who aren't looking too closely." Marcus spread the copied documents on his desk. "But look at this signature." Helena examined the signature Marcus was pointing to, then compared it to the documents Caldwell had shown them. The handwriting was similar, but there were subtle differences, small variations that suggested the same person had signed multiple names. "He's been doing this for years," Helena whispered, "and getting away with it because his victims were isolated, scared, and had no way to prove their innocence." Marcus looked up at her with determination blazing in his eyes. "But this time is different. Because this time he picked the wrong town to run his scheme in? Because this time he picked a victim who has friends willing to fight back." As Helena looked at the evidence spread across Marcus's desk, she felt something new stirring inside her. Not just hope, but anger. Righteous fury at a man who preyed on grieving widows, who built his wealth on the suffering of people who were already broken by loss. Caldwell had underestimated her, just as he had underestimated all his other victims. He saw a helpless woman with a baby, someone who would be too afraid to fight back. Tomorrow, Helena thought he was going to learn how wrong he was. The fire started around midnight. Sheriff Williams announced to the small crowd gathered outside the charred remains of the hotel. Good thing the wind was calm, or it might have taken half the town with it. Helena clutched Lily closer as she stared at the smoking ruins where Caldwell had been staying. The building was completely destroyed, and 2 other guests had barely escaped with their lives. But of Robert Caldwell there was no sign. "Anyone seen Caldwell this morning?" Marcus asked the sheriff. "That's what's got me puzzled," Williams replied, scratching his gray beard. "His room was on the 2nd floor, right where the fire was worst. But we haven't found any remains." Helena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "You think he escaped? Or he was never there when it started?" the sheriff said grimly. "Could be he set the fire himself and ran." Marcus exchanged a meaningful look with Helena. They had been planning to publish their exposé of Caldwell in today's edition of the newspaper. If he had learned about their investigation, burning down the hotel would be a perfect way to destroy evidence and create enough chaos to cover his escape. "Sheriff," Marcus said carefully, "there are some things about Mr. Caldwell you should know." Before Williams could respond, young Tommy Sullivan came running down the street, his face flushed with excitement and fear. "Mama says to tell you that the bad man took Mrs. Chun," he gasped, pointing toward the general store. "She saw him drag her into the alley behind the restaurant." Helena's blood turned to ice. Emma Chen, the quiet Chinese woman who had shared her story for their article, was exactly the kind of vulnerable target Caldwell would choose if he was desperate. "Where?" Sheriff Williams demanded, already reaching for his weapon. "Behind Chen's restaurant," Tommy said. "Mama saw it from our store window. She sent Papa to help, but she wanted me to get you." The sheriff was already moving Marcus close behind him. Helena started to follow, then stopped, looking down at Lily in her arms. She couldn't bring her baby into whatever confrontation was waiting in that alley. "Mrs. Sullivan," Helena called to the woman standing in front of her store. "Can you watch Lily?" "Of course, dear. But you shouldn't." Helena was already running, leaving Lily in the capable hands of her friend. She had spent too many weeks feeling helpless, too many days living in fear of what Caldwell might do. If Emma Chun was in danger because of the investigation Helena had helped start, then she couldn't just stand by and watch. The alley behind Chen's restaurant was narrow and dark, filled with wooden crates and barrels that created perfect hiding spots. Helena could hear voices coming from somewhere deeper in the shadows. Caldwell's smooth tones mixed with Emma's frightened protests. Sheriff Williams and Marcus were already moving carefully into the alley, their weapons drawn. Helena stayed back, but close enough to see what was happening. "Let her go, Caldwell," Williams called out. "It's over. We know what you've been doing." Caldwell's laughter echoed off the wooden walls. "Do you really? I don't think you have any idea what I'm capable of." Helena crept closer, using the stacked crates for cover. She could see Caldwell now, standing behind Emma Chun with one arm around her throat. In his other hand, he held a small Derringer pistol pressed against her temple. "Here's what's going to happen," Caldwell continued. "Mrs. Morrison is going to come out of hiding. Yes, I know you're there, Helena, and she's going to publicly admit that she owes me money. Then she's going to sign over her wages and her room at the newspaper as payment. And if she doesn't? Marcus asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer. Then Mrs. Chun here is going to have a terrible accident. And after that, maybe some other people in this town will start having accidents too. Helena felt rage building inside her like a storm. Caldwell wasn't just threatening her anymore. He was threatening innocent people, using them as weapons against her. The man who had already destroyed David's memory was now putting her friends in danger. "Let me see Mrs. Chun first," Helena called out, stepping into view. "Let me see that she's all right." "Helena, don't," Marcus warned, but she ignored him. Caldwell smiled when he saw her. "There she is. The grieving widow who's caused me so much trouble. I'm here. Now let Mrs. Chun go and we can talk." "We'll talk, all right. But Mrs. Chun stays exactly where she is until you give me what I want." Helena looked into Emma Chen's frightened eyes and saw something that surprised her. Not just fear, but determination. Emma was waiting for an opportunity, just like Helena was. "What exactly do you want?" Helena asked, moving closer. "I want you to stop playing games and pay your debt. $600, plus interest for all the trouble you've caused me. That's $700 now. I don't have $700. Then you'll work for me until it's paid off. There are plenty of places out west where a woman with your skills could earn good money." The implication was clear and disgusting. Helena felt sick, but she forced herself to keep walking closer. "And if I refuse? Then people start dying, beginning with your Chinese friend here." Helena was close enough now to see the sweat beading on Caldwell's forehead despite the cool morning air. He was desperate, cornered, and that made him more dangerous than ever. "You know," Helena said conversationally, "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about having friends in high places." Caldwell's eyes narrowed. "What about it?" "I was wondering if those friends know about your other business ventures. The forgery, the fraud, the pattern of cheating widows all across the territory. You can't prove any of that. Actually, we can." Helena pulled a folded paper from her pocket, one of the telegram responses Marcus had received. 3 towns, Robert. 3 towns where women report being approached by someone matching your description. And that's just the ones we found in one day. Caldwell's grip on Emma tightened, and Helena saw fear flicker across his face for the first time. "You're bluffing. The Denver marshal thinks differently. So does the territorial prosecutor's office. Turns out they've been looking for you for quite a while." Helena was close enough now to see Emma's eyes clearly. The other woman was no longer looking afraid. She was looking angry. And Helena realized that Emma was getting ready to do something. "Mrs. Chun," Helena said clearly, "when I count to 3, duck down as far as you can." "Shut up," Caldwell snapped, but Helena could see his confidence cracking. 1, Helena said loudly. Emma tensed. 2. Sheriff Williams and Marcus raised their weapons. 3. Emma Chun dropped like a stone, her knees buckling so suddenly that Caldwell lost his grip on her. At the same moment, Helena lunged forward, grabbing for Caldwell's gun hand. The derringer went off with a sharp crack, the bullet splintering wood somewhere above their heads. Helena and Caldwell went down in a tangle of arms and legs, fighting for control of the weapon. Helena had never been in a physical fight in her life, but desperation gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. She clawed at Caldwell's face, bit his wrist until he released the gun, and when he tried to hit her, she grabbed a handful of dirt and threw it in his eyes. By the time Sheriff Williams reached them, Helena was sitting on Caldwell's chest with the derringer pointed at his nose, her hair wild and her dress torn but her eyes blazing with triumph. "I believe," she said breathlessly, "this man is under arrest." As Williams put shackles on Caldwell, Helena helped Emma Chun to her feet. The other woman was shaking but unhurt, and her eyes held a new respect as she looked at Helena. "Thank you," Emma said simply. "Thank you for trusting me," Helena replied. Marcus appeared at her side, grinning despite the seriousness of what had just happened. "Remind me never to make you angry." Helena looked down at Caldwell, now defeated and helpless in the sheriff's custody. The man who had terrorized her across hundreds of miles, who had threatened her friends and tried to destroy her new life, looked smaller somehow, less frightening. "It's over," she said, and for the first time in months, she truly believed it. But even as she felt relief washing over her, Helena knew that the real test was still to come. Caldwell was caught, but she would have to testify against him, face questions about her past, and prove that she deserved the life she had built in Deadwood. The fight was won, but the war for her future was just beginning. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Harrison's gavel cracked against his wooden bench like a gunshot. Helena's hands trembled in her lap as she watched the stern-faced man in black robes study the papers before him, knowing that his next words would determine whether she kept her freedom or lost everything she had fought to build. "This court has reviewed the evidence presented against Mr. Robert Caldwell," Judge Harrison announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "The charges of fraud, forgery, and attempted kidnapping are serious matters that require careful consideration." Helena risked a glance at Caldwell, who sat in shackles between two deputies. Even in defeat, he managed to look confident, as if he believed his connections and smooth talk would save him. That worried her more than she wanted to admit. "However," the judge continued, "I am equally concerned about certain irregularities in the testimony provided by the prosecution's key witness." Helena's heart sank. She had known this moment would come, when her own past would be examined as closely as Caldwell's crimes. In a frontier court, a woman's word often counted for less than a man's, especially when that man claimed to be a respectable businessman. "Mrs. Morrison," Judge Harrison said, turning his attention to her, "you claim to have fled Denver to escape Mr. Caldwell's demands for payment of your husband's debts, yet you provided no forwarding address, no legal challenge to these supposed debts, no attempt to resolve the matter through proper channels." Helena stood on shaking legs. "Your Honor, I was a widow with an infant child and no money for lawyers. I thought if I came far enough away." "You thought you could simply disappear and avoid your obligations?" The judge's tone was sharp. "That is not how the law works, madam." "She had no obligations to avoid," Marcus said, rising from his seat in the gallery. "Those documents were forged after her husband's death." "Mr. Webb, you will speak when the court recognizes you," Judge Harrison warned. "Your newspaper articles and amateur detective work are not admissible evidence in this courtroom." Helena felt the room spinning around her. Everything she had hoped for, justice, vindication, the chance to prove her innocence, was slipping away. Worse, she could see approval in Caldwell's eyes as the judge questioned her motives and methods. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "I find it troubling that Mrs. Morrison has been living under what amounts to false pretenses, accepting employment and charity from unsuspecting citizens while concealing her true circumstances." "I never lied about who I was," Helena protested, finding her voice despite her fear. "I told Mr. Webb I was a widow looking for work. That was the truth. A partial truth, perhaps. But you failed to mention that you were fleeing what you believed to be legitimate debts. That omission calls your character into question." Helena felt tears threatening, but she forced them back. She would not give Caldwell the satisfaction of seeing her break down in court. "Your Honor," came a voice from the back of the courtroom. Helena turned to see Emma Chun standing up, her usual quiet demeanor replaced by determined courage. "May I speak?" Judge Harrison looked surprised. "This is highly irregular, but I will allow brief testimony if it relates to the matter at hand." Emma walked forward with dignity, her head held high despite the suspicious looks from some of the townspeople. In 1867 Dakota Territory, Chinese immigrants faced prejudice from many quarters, and Helena worried that Emma's testimony might hurt more than help. "Your Honor, Mrs. Morrison saved my life yesterday. When Mr. Caldwell held a gun to my head, she risked everything to protect me. That is not the action of someone with poor character. The court appreciates your gratitude, Mrs. Chun, but heroic actions do not excuse past deceptions." "I am not finished, Your Honor." Emma's voice carried a strength that surprised everyone in the room. "In my country, we have a saying, the measure of a person is not what they flee from, but what they build when they stop running. Mrs. Morrison stopped running when she came to Deadwood. She built a new life with honest work and kindness to others. Judge Harrison frowned. Mrs. Chun, while your loyalty is commendable, I am also a business owner in this town, Emma interrupted, something unheard of for someone in her position. Mrs. Morrison helped me when I faced my own troubles with people who did not want to accept my restaurant. She wrote about my family in the newspaper, made people see us as neighbors instead of outsiders. Is this the action of someone who deceives for personal gain? Helena felt warmth spreading through her chest as Emma spoke. She had helped write that article about the Chinese families in Deadwood, but she hadn't realized how much it had meant to them. More voices began rising from the gallery. Mrs. Sullivan stood up to talk about how Helena had helped organize the town's first school meeting. Tommy Sullivan's father spoke about Helena teaching his son to read better. Even the barber mentioned how Helena had helped him write letters to his family back east. Judge Harrison called for order, but Helena could see something changing in his expression. The picture being painted was not of a deceptive woman fleeing her responsibilities, but of someone who had become a valued member of the community. Your Honor, Marcus said when the room quieted. If I may present one additional piece of evidence? The judge nodded reluctantly. Marcus approached the bench with a telegram in his hand. This arrived this morning from the Denver City Marshal. It confirms that Mr. Caldwell is wanted on 17 counts of fraud involving forged documents. More importantly, it states that the original debt documents he claimed were signed by Mrs. Morrison's husband were filed 3 days after the man's death. Helena gasped. She had suspected the timing was wrong, but hearing official confirmation felt like a physical weight lifting from her shoulders. Judge Harrison examined the telegram carefully. This is indeed compelling evidence of fraud. However, it does not address the question of Mrs. Morrison's flight from Denver without attempting legal recourse. With respect, Your Honor, Helena said, standing again. What legal recourse did I have? I was a poor widow with no money for lawyers, facing a man who claimed to have powerful connections. When he suggested there were other ways I might pay my debt, Helena's voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. The judge's expression darkened. Are you claiming Mr. Caldwell made improper advances? I'm saying he made it clear that my options were limited if I couldn't pay in cash. Caldwell's lawyer jumped up. Objection. This is pure speculation and character assassination. Overruled, Judge Harrison said firmly. Mr. Caldwell will have opportunity to respond to these allegations. When Caldwell took the stand in his own defense, Helena watched his smooth confidence gradually crumble under the judge's pointed questions. The evidence was overwhelming. Forged documents, multiple victims across 3 territories, and witness testimony about his threats and violence. But it was Caldwell's own arrogance that ultimately destroyed him. When the judge asked about his business practices, Caldwell couldn't resist defending his legitimate collection methods and his right to pursue valid debts through any means necessary. Any means necessary? Judge Harrison repeated. Including threats of violence against uninvolved parties? Sometimes people need motivation to honor their obligations, Caldwell said, apparently not realizing how damning his words sounded. And what of Mrs. Chen's testimony that you held a gun to her head? She was interfering with a lawful debt collection. Judge Harrison's face grew thunderous. Mr. Caldwell, there is no law in this territory or any other that permits a private citizen to threaten violence against innocent parties in pursuit of supposed debts. Your admission of such tactics is, in itself, grounds for serious criminal charges. The trial concluded swiftly after that. Judge Harrison found Caldwell guilty on all counts, sentencing him to 10 years in territorial prison and ordering him to pay restitution to his various victims. As for Mrs. Morrison, the judge said, turning to Helena, while the court does not approve of your methods in fleeing Denver, the evidence clearly shows you were the victim of criminal fraud. All alleged debts are hereby declared null and void. Helena felt her knees buckle with relief. Marcus caught her arm, steadying her as the courtroom erupted in quiet celebration from the townspeople who had come to support her. But Judge Harrison wasn't finished. Mrs. Morrison, This court also notes the testimony regarding your contributions to this community. It appears that your decision to settle in Deadwood, regardless of your initial motivations, has benefited both yourself and your neighbors. He paused, studying her with eyes that seemed less stern than before. The territorial government is always in need of citizens who can contribute to the development of our communities. Your skills as a writer and your demonstrated character make you exactly the kind of settler we hope to attract. Helena looked around the courtroom at the faces of people who had become her friends and neighbors. Mrs. Sullivan was beaming, Emma Chun was smiling through tears, and Marcus looked proud enough to burst. "Thank you, Your Honor," Helena said, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. As the court session ended and people began filing out, Helena remained seated for a moment, absorbing what had just happened. The threat that had hung over her for months was finally gone. Caldwell would face justice for his crimes, and she was free to build the life she had started in Deadwood. But more than that, she had discovered something she hadn't expected to find. She had proven to herself and others that she was more than just a victim of circumstances. She was a fighter, a contributor, someone worthy of respect and friendship. The scared woman who had stumbled into town 3 months ago with nothing but a baby and desperate hope was gone forever. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who belonged. The sunrise painted the Dakota hills in shades of gold and pink as Helena stood outside the newspaper office, watching the town of Deadwood come to life. 6 months had passed since Caldwell's trial, and the settlement had grown in ways that amazed her daily. "The new schoolhouse looks good, doesn't it?" Marcus said, joining her with 2 steaming cups of coffee. Helena accepted the cup gratefully and looked toward the building that had been nothing but plans and dreams when she first arrived. Now it stood proud and solid, with real glass windows and a bell tower that rang every morning to call the children to their lessons. "Mrs. Patterson did beautiful work on the interior," Helena said. "Who would have thought the woman who runs the boarding house was so talented with a paintbrush?" "That's the thing about frontier towns," Marcus replied. "Everyone has hidden talents that only come out when they're needed." Helena smiled at that. It was certainly true in her case. 6 months ago, she never would have imagined herself as a published writer, but the story of Caldwell's fraud had been picked up by newspapers across the territory. Now she received regular requests for articles about life in the Dakota settlements. "Speaking of hidden talents," Marcus continued, pulling a letter from his pocket. "This came on yesterday's mail coach." Helena recognized the official seal of the territorial government immediately. Her heart skipped as she opened the letter and read the formal invitation inside. "They want me to speak at the statehood convention in Yankton," she said, barely believing the words. "About the role of women in frontier communities." "That's wonderful. You'll do it, won't you?" Helena looked down at the letter again, feeling a familiar flutter of uncertainty. The woman who had written the Caldwell exposé was confident and fearless, but Helena still sometimes felt like she was playing a role that didn't quite fit. "I don't know. Speaking to a room full of territorial delegates and politicians. What if I say the wrong thing? What if you say exactly the right thing?" Marcus countered. "Helena, you've lived the experience they need to understand. You know what it's like to start over with nothing, to build something meaningful from scratch." Before Helena could respond, the office door burst open and Tommy Sullivan ran in, his face bright with excitement. Miss Helena, you have to come see. The telegraph operator says there's a message for you from Washington." Helena and Marcus exchanged glances. A telegram from the nation's capital was not something that happened to ordinary people in Deadwood. At the telegraph office, a small crowd had already gathered. Word traveled fast in a town this size, and everyone was curious about what business their local celebrity might have with the federal government. The message was brief but stunning. "Mrs. Morrison, your article on frontier women's contributions noted by Department of the Interior. Request meeting to discuss potential government position. Contact territorial office soonest. Assistant Secretary Williams." "A government position?" Mrs. Sullivan gasped. "Oh my dear, how exciting." Helena stared at the telegram, feeling overwhelmed. 6 months ago, She had been a desperate widow with no prospects. Now she was being courted by the federal government for a job she couldn't even imagine. "What do you think it means?" she asked Marcus as they walked back to the office. "I think it means someone in Washington recognizes that the frontier needs people who understand it from the inside," Marcus said. "People who've actually lived the challenges instead of just reading about them in reports." That afternoon, Helena sat in the rocking chair in her room above the newspaper office, watching Lily play with the wooden blocks that had become her favorite toys. The baby was crawling now, pulling herself up on furniture and babbling in sounds that were almost words. Everything Helena had dreamed of was within reach. Recognition for her writing, opportunities beyond anything she had imagined, the chance to influence policy that would affect thousands of families like hers. But accepting any of these opportunities would mean leaving Deadwood, leaving the people who had become her family. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Emma Chun stood in the doorway, carrying a small basket covered with a bright cloth. "I brought dumplings," Emma said simply, "and I wanted to talk." They sat together at Helena's small table, sharing the delicious food while Lily entertained herself nearby. "Tommy Sullivan told everyone about your telegram," Emma said. "The whole town is buzzing with pride." "And worry," Helena admitted. "I can see it in people's faces. They think I'm going to leave." "Are you?" Helena had been avoiding that question all day, but Emma's direct approach made it impossible to dodge any longer. "I don't know. These opportunities, they're more than I ever dreamed possible. But this place, these people, you've all become my family." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "In my homeland, we believe that a tree's strength comes not just from its roots, but from how far its branches can reach. Perhaps your roots in Deadwood are strong enough now to support branches that extend far beyond our little town." "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe you don't have to choose between helping Deadwood and helping the wider world. Maybe you can do both." That evening, Helena walked the streets of Deadwood as she had done so many times before, but this time she was seeing it with new eyes. The settlement that had seemed like the end of the world when she first arrived now bustled with activity and purpose. The saloons were still there, but they competed for space with legitimate businesses. A bakery, 2 general stores, a proper doctor's office, and even a small library that met in the back room of the church. Families had replaced many of the rough miners and drifters who had dominated the town's early days. At the cemetery outside town, Helena stopped at David's grave. She had visited regularly in the early months, bringing Lily to talk to her father about their new life. But lately, she realized, she had been coming less often. "I think that's okay," she said aloud, addressing the simple wooden cross that marked David's resting place. "I think you'd want me to look forward instead of backward." The wind rustled through the pine trees that surrounded the cemetery, and Helena imagined she could hear David's voice telling her to be brave, to take chances, to build the life they had always talked about but never quite achieved. Back at the newspaper office, she found Marcus working late by lamplight, setting type for the next edition. "Decision made?" he asked without looking up from his work. "How did you know I was deciding anything?" "Because you get that look when you're wrestling with something important. Same look you had before you decided to help with the Caldwell investigation." Helena pulled up a chair beside him. "What if I took the government position but kept writing for the Tribune? What if I used that platform to make sure people in Washington understand what frontier communities really need?" Marcus finally looked up, his eyes bright with interest. "That would be quite a balancing act." "I've gotten good at balancing acts lately," Helena said, gesturing toward Lily, who was contentedly chewing on a wooden toy. "Besides, someone needs to make sure the politicians don't make decisions about our lives without understanding how we actually live. And you think you're the person to do that?" Helena thought about the scared woman who had knocked on this very door 6 months ago, begging for shelter from the cold. That woman would never have imagined she could influence government policy or speak at conventions. But that woman was gone, replaced by someone who had learned to fight for what mattered, who had discovered strengths she never knew she possessed. "Yes," Helena said with growing confidence. "I think I am." Marcus smiled and returned to his typesetting. "Then I guess I better start looking for someone to help cover your stories while you're traveling between here and the territorial capital. Any suggestions? Well, Emma-chan has been asking about learning to write articles for the paper. Says she wants to make sure the Chinese family's voices are heard. Helena felt a warm glow of satisfaction. The cycle was continuing. Someone who had been helped was now ready to help others, to make sure no one's story went untold. Later that night, as she tucked Lily into the crib Marcus had built, Helena looked out the window at the lights scattered across Deadwood. Each light represented a family, a dream, a story of someone who had come to this harsh land looking for something better. Tomorrow, she would send her reply to Washington, accepting whatever opportunity they offered while making it clear that her loyalty remained with places like Deadwood and people like the ones who had given her a chance. The scared widow was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that true strength came not from avoiding challenges, but from facing them with the support of people who believed in you. Helena Morrison had found her voice, and she intended to use it.